Welcome, everyone, to another exciting class on Enoch. Enoch just doesn't end. And that's because everyone was super into the character of Enoch and having books where he's either visiting the heavens, or you're learning about the story of the Watchers, or he's giving you lessons on astronomy, or he is foreseeing the end of the world, or probably not necessarily the end of the world, but let's say the judgment day and what comes after. And in this class, and probably in our next class as well, that's what we're going to be looking at more. Today we're going to be looking at something that's called the animal apocalypse. Next week, we're going to be looking at the apocalypse of weeks and what's called the Book of Noah, which is a short thing where Noah is kind of presented almost as a messianic figure. And I'm looking at a lot of it from the lens of biblical interpretation, but of course we are going to talk about kind of the vision of the end time that is being presented here. In particular, in the animal apocalypse, it's actually very interesting because we have a new concept that we don't see much elsewhere. Now, before I start, I would like to address some things that came up last class and kind of put things in order, okay? So I'm going to go and also correct some things. So as I mentioned in the last class, besides first Enoch, we have second Enoch and third Enoch. Second Enoch, also called Slavonic Enoch, survived in Old Bulgarian. We have copies from the 14th to 18th centuries. It's not generally considered a Jewish work. It's usually considered a Christian work from the 1st century CE or later, from the 1st century of the Common Era or later. Now, third Enoch is part of what's called the Hechalot literature. Hechalot literature being literature that involves ascending through the heavenly palaces. In third Enoch, which places itself in the 2nd century of the Common Era, but probably dates to the 5th century of the Common Era, Rabbi Yishmael meets Metatron, and he says to Metatron, hey, what's your story? And Metatron says, I used to be Enoch. Okay, so that's where we have that Enoch is Metatron thing coming in as part of the Hechalot literature. Now, some people argue that it's hinted to in second Enoch as well. That is an argument, but it's not stated explicitly. And also, so the question frequently is, where does second Enoch fit in the Enochic literature? So I'm not going to address that again, because many people take it out of, most people do not consider it part of Jewish literature. However, third Enoch absolutely is. Again, third Enoch places itself in the rabbinic tradition, again, with Rabbi Yishmael, etc. And it presents this idea that Enoch ascended to become Metatron. Okay. Now, if you guys are really, really interested, because I'm not taking any questions on this now, I can do a class where we talk briefly about third Enoch, Metatron, the 4 that went into the Pardes, all that, and a little bit about Hechalot literature. Again, it'll just be kind of an intro to all of that, and only one class, because it takes us out of our era and our topic, which is Second Temple interpretation. Now, there are connections between some Second Temple literature and the Hechalot literature, and I will address those no matter what. If we have a class on Hechalot literature, I will bring it up there. Okay, so if there's something like everyone's like, yes, we must have this class. If you've already learned Hechalot literature from someone else, stick with that. You don't need it from me. Okay, you're not going to get some kind of super deep knowledge on Hechalot literature, because again, I'm coming from Second Temple stuff. My interest in Hechalot literature is only to the extent that it really connects. I shouldn't say that. That's not true, because I'm Jewish and I am part of this tradition. So I am interested in general. And I will say, since we're using the word Hechal over and over and over again, I will remind you of the fun history of Hechal, which is, of course, it comes from the word in Sumerian. This was 2 words, Egal, big house. Okay, Sumerian is not a Semitic language, but it had many words were adopted into Akkadian, which is a Semitic language. Was a Semitic language. Akkadian took the word Egal, big house, used it for palace. It became the word ekalu or ekalum when they still use the enclitic m or mem. The u is a case ending, so it's ekal plus the And then that became in Hebrew Hecha, which is frequently used for a temple, can be used for palace, but usually like chamber or temple. But it comes actually all the way from that Sumerian phrase, big house.
Is it connected to the Greek Ecclesiastes?
That's a great question, but no, I don't think so, because Ecclesiastes comes from the gathering together, right? That's why Kohelet is Ecclesiastes, right? Kohelet, gathering together, kahal, kila, and Ecclesiastes uses that meaning, right? Then Ben Sira is called Ecclesiasticus because you read it in church, nothing to do with Ecclesiastes, kahal, Kohelet, okay? That's if we're going to go into linguistics, okay, so that's, yeah. Okay, so now today what we're going to do is we're going to look at what's called the animal apocalypse. It's part of and I'll remind you, the book of First Enoch is actually a collection of books. And that book we're looking at is the visions of Enoch. The visions of Enoch is generally, I should say the book of dream visions, excuse me. So that's usually called the book of dream visions. It's dated generally around 163 to 160 BCE, before the Common Era, after the battle at Beit Sor. That's assuming that that a certain passage is referring to that battle. So it's presumed to be around that time. So that puts it later, certainly than the Book of Watchers, earlier than some of the other parts of this book. Let's just dive right in. Of course, I will share my screen as usual. Here we are. Okay, again, I am using the eclectic translation by Nickelsburg and Vanderkam. You can't really see it here clearly because of the blur factor, but it's easy to get. And an eclectic translation for this particular part is actually really good because there are pieces of this we have in the Greek, and there are pieces of this we have in Aramaic, and an eclectic translation can take advantage of that to give us something that may be a little closer to the original, rather than a translation that focuses, let's say, only on the Ethiopian. Okay. So dream vision starts with kind of a quick vision of what's going to happen at the end time. It's very, very vague. I'm going to, in the interest of time, because there are lots of apocalypses in Enoch, I'm going to kind of go right into the animal apocalypse. Okay, so here we go. The animal apocalypse, and again, these titles that we see, Enoch's Second Dream Vision, The History of Humanity, Introduction to the Vision, none of those are in the original. These are titles we're being given by Nickelsburg to make things easier for us, okay? And in fact, in this section, there's a flip of some of the verses in the Ethiopic, which we have to kind of reverse in order for things to make sense. Somehow things got corrupted. Okay, so after this, I saw a second dream, and I will show all of it to you, my son. This is Enoch speaking to his son Methuselah, Enoch speaking to Methuselah, right? He says, "To you I speak, my son, hear my words and incline your ear to the dream vision of your father." Now, what we're going to see is a retelling of the history of the world from a, let's say, Israelite Jewish perspective, coming up to the present time, told in animals. Okay, why told in animals? I am actually gonna, let me just pause this, because this is something that it does feel a little weird. It can be fun, but the question is, why do this when, especially in some cases where it's simply retelling it? It's just retelling it with animals. It's adding almost nothing in certain places, and that is because it adds a layer of mystery. It makes it feel cryptic and something you have to figure out. It's a secret because we're telling in the animals. We have to make that extra step. And I frequently in advertising, like something that people talk about in certain, what makes an advertisement good. Certain advertisements are good if it makes you try to figure something out. You have to kind of you have to make some kind of logical leap in order to get the ad, and then you're like, oh, I got it, right? So this is the same sort of thing. Like, oh, I know who it's talking about. It makes it more appealing and interesting, and it makes you want to kind of engage with it. Okay, so let's jump in. Okay. Um, so Adam and Eve and their children. Before I took your mother Edna as my wife, I saw in a vision on my bed, and look, a bull came forth from the earth, and that bull was white. Now, in the animal apocalypse, white is good, white is pure, black is bad, and red seems to be actually kind of neutral. Red is an okay color for cattle, and red is not, seems to be not pure, but not bad, okay? Generally, right? A bull came forth from the earth. That bull was white, and after it, a young heifer came forth. Okay, Adam and Eve, right? And with her, 2 bull calves came forth. One of them was black, and one was red. Okay, so you have the black one is going to be Cain, and the red one is going to be Abel. And that black calf struck the red one and pursued it over the earth. And here it could be that it should have been and was pursued over the earth. And from then on, I could not see that red calf. In other words, here's Enoch. He's telling the vision, and he's like, he hit the red calf, and then I don't know, it disappeared. What happened to it? Don't know, right? No more red calf, okay? But that black calf grew up, and a young heifer came to it, and I saw that many cattle came forth from it. So Cain is having children, all right? And then that female calf, and this is Chava, Eve, that first one went forth from the presence of that first bull. She searched for that red calf, but did not find it. And she lamented bitterly over it and searched for it. This is interesting because it's almost a midrash on the story, because in this story, Chava doesn't know what happened. Eve doesn't know what happened to Abel. He was killed in the field. She doesn't know what happened. And she's searching for him, and she's crying over him. Okay. And I looked until that first bull came to her and quieted her. And from that time on, she did not cry out. After this, she bore another white bull. And after she bore many black bulls and cows. So this white bull is Shet, right? Seth, right? So that this is the child that she has, right? If we look at, I believe I have the verse open here. Yes. Vayeda Adam odet ishto, right? And Adam had relations with his wife. Vateled ben vatikrat shmo Shet, right? She called her son, his name Shet. Kishatli Elohim zera acher. Tachat hevel ki harago Cain. So in this verse, she clearly knows that Cain killed him, right? But there is an idea that the birth of Seth, comforted her from the loss of Cain, from loss of Hevel. Okay. Moving back to our text, okay. And after this, she bore another white bull. After it, she bore many black bulls and cows. And then she had children who are just no good. And I saw in my sheep sleep that white bull, that it grew likewise. And they were talking now about Shet, and became a large white bull. And from it came forth many white cattle, and they were like it. And they began to bear many white cattle. So these are the good guys. Okay. So the black calf grew up and is doing whatever. This white Seth, he's having good odds. Now that actually becomes very, very central later on in later Christian thought, and later it comes back to Jewish thought, and the idea that actually let's continue on, and we'll get back to that idea in just a bit. And again, I saw with my eyes as I was sleeping. I saw the heaven above, and look, a star fell from heaven, and it arose and was eating and pasturing among those cattle. This is the fall of the watchers to mate with human women. Okay, that's what this is. All right. And what we have here now, the same as we had an interpretation of the biblical passage, we're going to have an interpretation of the Watcher story, pretty much as it's told in the book of the Watchers in Enoch. This is almost an interpretation of that book of the Watchers. So that's what I mean when I say they're in the same book, but this book is actually an interpretation of that one. So then I saw those large and black cattle, and look, all of them exchanged their pens and their pastures and their calves, and they began to moan one after the other. It seems like what's going on here, and here what's happening is that they're mating with it looks like that they're mating with possibly the bad ones. The bad ones are complaining. It's possible this is indicating that violence already started. And again, I saw in the vision, and I looked to heaven, and look, I saw many stars descend. You have one star, and it could be that this star is supposed to be the angel Asael that teaches them about how to make weapons of war, how to put on makeup, causing sins of lust and violence, right? And that's the first star. And then the next stars are the ones who come with Shemichaza to mate with women. Okay, so in other words, this is really trying to be a fairly precise interpretation of the story, right? In the midst of those calves, they became bulls, and they were pasturing with them in their midst. So they pretend to be human, right? That's how they're going to kind of trick the cows. And I looked at them and I saw and looked, all of them let out their organs like horses, and they began to mount the cows of the bulls. They all conceived and bore elephants and camels and asses. This is where I got censored in my commentary. I wrote in my commentary, it says, I looked at them and I saw and looked, all of them let out their organs like horses. And I said, the angels are pretending to be human, but they're still a different species where it counts, right? That's what I did. And I got sent, they said to me, are you sure you want to keep this in? I'm like, yeah, keep it in. Like, you have jokes like that all the time in academics, like it's barely anything. And they asked me, I said, keep it in, and they changed it. Here, I said, it says, the Watchers remain a different species in terms of their sexual organs. Well, thank you. You just made it boring, right? Anyway. But, okay, moving on. I'll speed up a little so I don't bore all of you guys. Wait, are there questions?
You seem to be using angels and watchers interchangeably.
Yeah, I mean, yes, watchers are a type of angels, and here it's important to note, I can keep on saying watchers instead of angels. Later on, there are going to be other angels who come to punish the watchers, right? I could stay consistent, but the watchers are angels. So like part of what I'm saying, the reason I'm calling them angels is because it's also important that there are different species, right? They're angels, and they're being represented, they're different. This is the thing, so they're stars, they fall from heaven, and then they pretend to be human, right?
But Miriam,
yes.
When you say angels, like in the Bible, in the Torah, like angel is just a malach, is just a shaliach, just a messenger, and in the Second Temple, malach is like that creature with wings. So which one are you referring to?
I'm referring to a creature with wings. Like they don't particularly go into wings, but yeah, it's a heavenly creature that has a name, right? This is Second Temple. This itself, the passage we're reading here, is an interpretation of a Second Temple work, which itself is an interpretation of Genesis 6:1-4. Okay, but what we're reading here is an interpretation of Second Temple work. So here, those angels are what we think of now as angels, right? They had an existence in heaven. They're coming down. They're not obeying the divine order the way they should be, and they're going to end up punished. So the first one that drops is almost certainly Asael, who in the Book of the Watchers teaches humans knowledge that ends up causing sin, right? And the later stars are almost certainly the angels that are being led by Shemichaza, who has a goal of having children and mating with human women and having children, right? Which angels aren't allowed to have because they live forever, right? That's what we're told in the Book of the Watchers. This is why angels don't get to have kids. They live forever, okay? And also they're supposed to be in the heaven. They're not supposed to be on earth.
Miriam?
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't this placing the fall of the Watchers very early in the generation of Shet instead of like just before the flood?
It's no, because this doesn't talk about this. This isn't. It's gonna go right into the flood. So it's not. It's just it aligns all the generations. It's not going generation by generation. You know what I mean? Like it's like, and after that, this is what happened. Like this is the next important thing. We've already seen that Shet had a lot of descendants, and then this happens, right? So Shet has a lot of descendants. This happens. This account kind of skips around to what it thinks is important. It doesn't recount everything, right? And in fact, there are certain things that are a big deal in biblically that it doesn't see as that much of a big deal. We'll see that in just a second. So, okay, so we had two stages of angels falling with their different purposes. The first one causes sin, that's the moaning, right? The second one mates with the women, and then they have they all conceived and bore elephants and camels and asses, animals that look weird, Okay, in other words, there's something wrong. They're not cows. There's these different species, right? And all the bulls feared them and were terrified before them. And they began to bite with their teeth and devour and gore their horns. And this is the idea that the giants that are born from the mating of the watchers with women cause violence to grow, cause that violence that ends up in the flood, right? So they're causing the violence, and they're causing violence throughout. And they began to devour those bulls. And that's also in the early work of the Watchers, that they actually are eating them, right? And look, all the sons of the earth began to tremble and quake before them and to flee. And again, I saw them, they began to gore one another and devour one another, and the earth began to cry out. And I lifted my eyes again to heaven, and I saw, and now there's going to be the punishment of the Watchers, okay, by the good angels, okay, with the appearance of white men. In general, in an animal apocalypse, men are angels. If humans are animals, so men are angels, with two exceptions. We're going to see one of them with Noah. Both Noah and Moshe become men when they are going to build something. Noah becomes a man to build the Teva, the ark. Moshe becomes a man to build the tabernacle, the Mishkan. It's not clear whether that act is they're being elevated, or if it's simply that for the author, that's a bridge too far. You can't say animals built an ark, so you have to say he's a man to build the ark. Okay, so, but in general, when you see man, it means angel here. So the appearance of white men, 4 came forth from that place, and 3 with them. And those 3 who came after took hold of me by my hand and raised me from the generations of the earth. So if we're talking about who these guys are, so it's actually, get this. Yeah, so if they're identical to the Greek version of the Book of the Watchers, then these 3 are Uriel, Reuel, and Remiel. And then the 4 who punish the Watchers are Raphael, Gavriel, Michael, and Sariel. Okay, just so you know. Okay, so we have the 4. And as I looked in the vision, look, one of those 4 who had come forth hurled stones from heaven and gathered and took all the great stars, whose organs were like the organs of horses, and bound all of them by their hands and their feet and threw them into an abyss of the earth. Now, I also think the fact that they're saying their organs are organs of horses is also saying that they have defiled themselves sexually. In other words, it's kind of insulting them as well. So they're bound and thrown into the abyss. Okay, and I'm sorry, and I skipped. Gabriel is the one who, or is it Gabriel or Michal? Now I don't remember which angel gives the sword in the Book of the Watchers. I think it's Gabriel. Yes, Gabriel. So in the first, I saw one of those 4 come before he sees that first star. The person who punished, the one who punishes Asael is Raphael. Raphael binds Asael. All of this is actually in the Book of the Watchers. This is just a straight interpretation of the Book of the Watchers. And one of these drew a sword that's Gabriel, and he gave it to those elephants and camels and asses. He gives it to the giants, and they begin to strike one another, and the whole earth quaked because of them. In the Book of the Watchers, you have the giants, right? And part of the punishment of their fathers, where the whole point was they wanted kids, is that Gabriel causes them to kill each other. He gives them, weapons, and they kill each other in front of their fathers. It's part of the angels' punishment, and then the angels are bound and put into the abyss. And this is what's happening here. And moving right along, and then we get to the flood. Then we get to Noah and the flood. And one of those 4 went to one of the white bulls and taught it a mystery, trembling as it was. He goes to Noah and he teaches him secrets, perhaps to protect him from evil. Or the secrets of medicine is also a possibility. He was born a bull, but it became a man. And he built himself a vessel and dwelt in it. And the 3 bulls dwelt with him. That's his 3 sons. And the vessel was covered and roofed over them. And again, I lifted my eyes toward heaven. And now we have the flood. Okay, so we have the flood. And that vessel was floating on the waters, but all the bulls and elephants and camels and asses sank to the bottom together with every animal, so I could not see them. So all the giants are killed in the flood. Okay, the giants. Okay, but I'm going to skip skip forward, okay? And we have, it's talking about Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Shem is white, Ham is black, black because he sinned, not because of a race thing. And Yafet is red, which is the neutral, right? Shem goes, the white bull actually, it's Noah passes away. And they began to beget wild beasts and birds. So remember when I said it skips over stuff? It doesn't have anything about the Tower of Babel, right? None of the, like that's what you would expect here. You'd have expect a Tower of Babel story, and then all of a sudden you have different species. It just, no. They just began to have different species. The different species are the different nations, okay? And it's listing lions, leopards. We're going to come back to who is who afterwards. But among them, a white bull was born, okay? You know that white bull is going to be Abraham. Okay, and note, the Abraham is still a bull. He's not a sheep, right? Jews are a sheep. He's going to stay he's still a bull because the Jews haven't been separated out. Among them, a white bull was born. They began to bite one another, but that white bull that was born among them begot a wild ass and a white bull with it. Who's the wild ass? He's Ishmael, right? He's Ishmael because Pere Adam also means being a wild ass of a person. He's going to be a Pere Adam, a wild ass of a person, right? And based on that, based on Genesis 16:12, Reshit Tet Zayin Yud Bet, right? We have this idea of Ishmael as a donkey, okay? So he has a bull, right? That's Yitzchak, and Ishmael. That's a donkey. That's and a donkey. That's Ishmael. Okay. As we and then okay, and the wild asses increased. Ishmael has lots of children, but that bull that was born from it begot a black wild boar and a white ram of the flock. So that bull, which is Yitzchak, has a wild boar, which is Esav, which is Edom. Edom are going to be pigs, right? And it's black because he's a bad guy, right? And a white ram of the flock. Suddenly we have sheep, because from Yaakov on, Jews are sheep. Now we're sheep, okay? So general, we'll get back to the idea of kind of the prototype man is a regular man is a bull / cow. Jews are ram / sheep, okay? So here is a ram. And he is Yaakov. And that wild boar begot many boars, right? Edom has lots of, Esav has lots of children, and that ram begat 12 sheep, right? You have the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Yaakov. When those 12 sheep had grown up, they handed over one of themselves to the wild asses. And those wild asses, in turn, handed that sheep over to the wolves. And that sheep grew up among the wolves. What are we talking about here? Someone jump in. Who's been listening?
The wild asses are the Ishmaelim who Yosef was turned over to.
Right. So he turned over Yosef to Ishmaelim, right? And what about the Midianim that he's also sold to? We'll see that in just a second. It's not going to be that much of a surprise when we get to, actually skip ahead in just a moment, right? And that sheep grows up among the wolves. Who are the wolves going to be, of course? The wolves are?
The Egyptians?
The Egyptians, right? The Egyptians. And once you know a nation, it's usually pretty consistent. So the wolves are going to be Egyptians, not the Holy, right? So that sheep grew up among the wolves, and the ram led forth the 11 sheep to dwell with it and to pasture with it among the wolves. They all moved to Egypt, right? And they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to fear them and oppress them until they did away with their young, right? And that's what it says, that they were scared that they're going to rise up land. So they killed, right, all the male children. They cast their young into a river of much water. The sheep began to cry out because they're young and to make complaint to the Lord. This is a pretty close retelling, even though it's skipping things. And a sheep that had escaped safely from the wolves fled and went off to the wild asses. Who's the sheep who escaped safely from the Egyptians? He is?
Moshe, I assume.
Moshe. But he goes off to the wild asses. When did Moshe go off to the Ishmaelim? But this, of course, is solving an exegetical problem, right? Which is this one, right? You see in front of you, we're looking at Genesis 37:28, Lamed Zayin Chafret, right? When I'll just read it in English because we're doing this quickly. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Yosef up out of the pit. The one would assume the brothers sold Yosef for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. So who was buying him, the Midianite traders or the Ishmaelite traders? So there are a couple. The classic one is, well, it's the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites. That is kind of the classic Jewish interpretation. You could also say that the term Yishmaelim here is being used for merchants and not for a specific ethnicity. What our interpreter is saying is they're the same guys. They're all the same donkeys, okay? You sold them. That's what you don't understand, right? Because when Moshe goes to the Midianites and he goes and marries there and shelters there, they are donkeys. They are like the Ishmaelites. They're the same nation, okay? Now, so if we go, so this is actually trying to solve a problem in the verse. That's why it's saying calling Midianites donkeys. I see that there's a question here. Susan says, do any commentaries make a connection to the red, black, and white horses in Zechariah? Not that I know of. Not that I know of, because here it's very clearly making a moral judgment. It's very clear if you read it through. Black is really bad, white is pure, and red tends to be neither. Okay, so that's an interesting exegetical kind of thing, and clearly the reason why Moshe is a sheep that had escaped safely from the wolves. The Egyptians fled and went off to the wild asses, who are in this case Midianites. And I saw the sheep groaning and crying out and petitioning their Lord. Okay, this is now we're going to have the Exodus, etc. I'm going to skip through because I don't want to weary everyone too much. If anyone's read ahead and has a particular question, please ask. We have the splitting of the Red Sea, and et cetera, et cetera. And then that sheep, we have Sinai, and I saw until the Lord of the sheep was pasturing them and giving them water and grass, and that sheep was going and leading them, that sheep being Moshe. That sheep went up to the summit of a high rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And after that, I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was majestic and fearful and mighty. And all those sheep saw him and were afraid before him. And all of them were afraid and trembling because of him, and they were crying out after that sheep with the other sheep that was in their midst. We cannot stand before our Lord and look at him. This is talking about that passage where it's the beginning of kind of the revelation at Sinai, and they're like, no, we can't deal with it. We can't have it straight. Moshe, you need to be in between us. You need to be the one who tells it, because we can't stand before God saying these things. We're going to die. And here we have the Egel. And again, that sheep that led them went up to the summit of that rock, and the sheep began to be blinded and to stray from the path that it had shown them. But the sheep did not know about these things, the sheep being Moshe. So there's the sheep that were below, we're going to be blinded. Being blinded in not just this apocalypse, but many places in Second Temple literature and in Enochic literature, being blinded means going astray. Being blinded means you don't see the truth and you're sinning. That's what being blinded is. Okay. So they're being blinded and they're straying from the path, and the Lord of the sheep was filled with great wrath against them. And that sheep, Moshe, discovered it and went down from some of that rock. He joins with the Levium. They kill some people. He brings all the straying sheep back into the fold. And then it says, and I saw in this vision, until that sheep became a man. Remember, Moshe also needs to become a man and build something. And he built a house for the Lord of the sheep and made all the sheep stand in the house. That's the Mishkan, the tabernacle, etc. Let's move right ahead. Okay. The next section is also clearly, and here we also see just an interpretation of Shoftim, the judges, right? I saw until he ceased crying for that sheep. Sometimes their eyes were opened and sometimes they were blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. That's kind of the refrain in Shoftim and Judges. They would do whatever they wanted, and then they would cry out to God for help, for a savior, and God would send them a savior. that's that in a nutshell. That's the time of the judges. And then we have here here when we have the dogs began to devour the sheep, the dogs are going to be the Philistines. The wild boars, of course, are Edom, as we noted. The foxes are the Ammonites. And they were devouring them until the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram from among the sheep which led them. This sheep is this sheep is Shaul. Okay, Saul. And this ram began to butt and pursue with its horns and hurled itself against the foxes, after them against the wild boars. It destroyed many wild boars, and after them it struck the dogs. And the sheep whose eyes were open saw the ram among the sheep until it forsook its path and began to walk where there was no path. Right? Shaul, he goes astray. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. Okay. And the Lord of the sheep sent the sheep to another sheep who appointed to be ram to rule the sheep instead of the ram that had forsaken its way. There's so many sheep, it gets confusing. Samuel is being sent to anoint David in place of Saul. Okay. Now, none of this would make any sense to any of us if we didn't know the story by heart. And that's what the author is assuming. He's assuming that his audience knows this story by heart. So they can read this or hear it and know exactly what he's talking about. There's this sheep and that sheep and the other sheep, but they know all the sheep because they know the book of Samuel. They know the book of Kings. They know what happened. Okay, they know the story, and so they can easily connect this. I'm going to kind of skip ahead because it just keeps going this way. Lots and lots of sheep. We have the building of the temple. In here, if you're looking at is chapter 48, verse 50, and that house became large and broad, and a large and high tower was built upon that house, the Lord of the sheep. The house is Jerusalem, and the tower is the temple. Okay, that house was low, but the tower was raised up and was high. Jerusalem was low. If you think of Ir David, it's low. It's not the highest part of Jerusalem, but the tower was raised up and high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they spread a full table before him. God is in the temple, and they're bringing him sacrifices. Okay. Then we have the two kingdoms. They go astray. They abandoned the house of the Lord and his tower. They went astray in everything, and their eyes were blind. Right. I saw that the Lord of the sheep worked much slaughter on them in their pastures, because those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. They've done so badly that he's going to abandon them to the nations. And that's what we have here. He abandoned them into the hands of the lions and the leopards. The lions here, so if we're talking, so what's the lions are pretty much certainly the Babylonians, Chaldeans, right? The wolves, we already know, are Egyptians. The foxes, we already know, are Ammonites, from Ammon. Nicholsburg thinks that this is based on this verse here, 2 Kings 24, 2 Melachim bet Chafdalad bet, right? God let loose against him the raiding bands of the Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites, right? And so then we can kind of fill in our missing nations, okay? And I saw that he abandoned that house of theirs and their tower, and he threw them all into the hands of the lions, right? This is the Babylonian destruction. I began to cry out with all my might and to call to the Lord of the sheep and to show him concerning the sheep, because they were devoured by all the wild beasts. And he was silent, though he saw it. And he rejoiced because they were devoured and swallowed up and carried off. And he abandoned them into the hands of all the beasts as fodder. This is tremendously harsh, and this isn't the end of the harshness. God made a decision to abandon Israel because they were sinning. And this is what they had coming to them. He let them be carried off. He let them be devoured. He let them be punished in this way. And of course, this is making a very important statement, saying this wasn't a victory against God. This was something that God intended and decided and let happen. And then, of course, you have the flip side of that problem, which is, well, then how is God, right, benevolent? And the answer is, well, they sinned. Okay, so Moshe says the apocalypse of the sheeple. How true? Yes, indeed. And then it doesn't end because we have these 70 shepherds. Now we think that this is going to be good, right? 70 shepherds are going to take care of the sheep. The question is, are these shepherds angels because they're men, right? Or at this point, are we just being more metaphorical? Shepherds are leaders because shepherds are leaders, right? And he summoned 70 shepherds and he left those sheep to them that they might pasture them. And he said to the shepherds and their subordinates, every one of you from now on shall pasture the sheep, and everything that I command you do, which is what makes me think that this is supposed to be people and not angels. God is saying, you are their leaders. I'm commanding you. You do what I'm telling you. I'm handing them over to you duly numbered, and I will tell you which of them are to be destroyed. Destroy them. And he handed those sheep over to them. And another one he summoned and said to him, observe and see everything the shepherds do against these sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. Every excess and destruction that is done by the shepherds write down, how many they destroy at my command and how many they destroy on their own. Every destruction by each individual shepherd write down against them. And essentially they're going to get punished for it. Now, actually, we're very used to this idea that how can God punish if God sent the Babylonians after and he gave them permission, as it were, to punish Israel, then how can the Babylonians be punished? The answer is they punished us more than we deserved, more than they were supposed to. That's the classic answer, and that's what we're seeing here. He's giving these shepherds, so it's possible that these 70 shepherds are, if we connect it to the idea of 70 nations, right? The later idea of 70 nations, you can say, oh, are these supposed to be the shepherds, the angels that are leading the other nations, and they're punishing? Or are these supposed to be 70 leaders who are not doing their job? So if we were going to connect it to biblical verses, we have this verse in Zechariah. We have more than one verse, but let's bring this one. Yud Aleph Tet Zayin, that's 11:16. Ki hine anochi mekim ro'eh ba'aretz, hanichadot lo yifkod, hana'ar lo yivakesh, hanishberet lo yirapeh, hanitzava lo yichalkel, uvsar habriya yochal, ufarsen yifarek. I'm going to give this land a shepherd, a leader, who not only is he not going to take care of the missing sheep, and he's not going to look after the young sheep, and he's not going to heal the hurt. He's also not going to feed the ones who can't feed themselves. He's going to eat the healthy ones, and he's going to break their hooves. He's actually going to harm. He's not only not going to help, he's going to harm, right? So this idea of God will appoint leaders who are going to actively harm the people as a punishment, right? But in this case, he's also calling them to account, right? And by number, read them in my presence, how many they destroy and how many they hand over to destruction, so that I may have this testimony against them, that I may know every deed of the shepherds, that I may measure them and see what they are doing, whether they're acting according to the command that I gave them or not, and do not let them know it, and do not show them or rebuke them, but write down every destruction by the shepherds one by one in his own time, and bring it all to me. So depending on whether you see these shepherds as foreign nations or as corrupt leaders, what this is saying is they will be called to account. Yes, we suffered because we sinned and it was God's decision, but these who have done this to us, they will be punished. They will be punished. They don't know they have it coming, but it's coming to them. Okay. And then we go into, yes.
So these shepherds may be foreign leaders, or they might be actually Jewish leaders?
Yeah, so if you're looking at something like Zechariah, that sounds like it's a Jewish leader, right? So it really, it's hard to tell here. Are we talking, because it's a very weird situation to say, I'm going to summon 70 shepherds, right? It sounds like Jewish leaders or leaders. It sounds like these are the actual leaders of, let's say, Jewish people, or the Judahites, or the Israelites, whatever you want to call them. That they're the leaders of the Jewish people because he said he's leaving them to pasture them, right? And he says, I'm going to tell you how many to destroy, right? Which is a weird thing to say to a leader of the people, but he knows they're going to destroy even more. Okay, now you could also say that these are foreign leaders, foreign rulers, right? Who, on the one hand, we were given into their hands, they're supposed to take care, but they're also foreign leaders and they're going to destroy, but they're going to destroy more. It's very, there's a lot of different ways, because you can absolutely say, all right, the 70 shepherds, like the 70 nations, we're 70, we have 7 shepherds in Micah, right? But that doesn't seem to be in a negative way the same way, even though you can also read those in 2 different ways. But here we have the 70. It's not, and it's really not clear. You can absolutely say they're Jewish leaders, but then why are there so many? But here we have, it actually does go into each period of time. Okay, so the first period begins right before the destruction of the first temple. Okay, so we say, and I saw until those shepherds were pasturing each in his time, and they began to kill and destroy many more than they had been commanded, and they abandoned those sheep into the hands of the lions. So this is implying that these are Jewish leaders, right? So the land, because the lions are the Babylonians, right? So this is, but what would you mean by saying the Jewish leaders are themselves killing and destroying? It's a little strange. The lions and leopards devoured and swallowed up most of these sheep, and the wild boars devoured along with them. The wild boars, remember, being Edom, devoured along with them. This is actually a pretty good interpretation, because on the one hand, Edom is not one of the conquering nations, right? They're not the Babylonians that are conquering. However, as we know, and here again as an example, in Obadiah, Yud Aleph in Obadiah 11, right? It says, B'yom ha'matchami neged, it's talking to Edom, right? It's talking to Edom. B'yom ha'matchami neged, b'yom shvot zarim kelo, v'nachrim ba'u sharav Yerushalayim yadu gora, gam ata ka'achad mehem. On that day, when these foreigners came in and took spoils, and they came into the gates and split Jerusalem by lot, you also were one of them. You came along to take your share, right? And that's what this is showing. And it's actually staying pretty close to that verse and saying you were at the wild boars devoured along with them, right? And they burnt down that tower and demolished the house, right? They burnt down the temple and demolished Jerusalem. And I grieved exceedingly over that tower, and because that house of the sheep had been demolished, right? And then the shepherds and their subordinates handed over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them. They go into exile, right? Each of them individually in his time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're being tracked. God is keeping track of of how much they're destroying. And then the second period, this is nice because Nicholasberg is giving you the title, the 23 shepherds from the return to Alexander. So we already know the time. Of course, if you were just reading this, you wouldn't have that nice little marker. So this is the return to Zion, from the return to Zion to Alexander of Macedonia. And that takes us, here we have the beginning again to build as before. Here, 3 of those sheep return. So 3 of those sheep, they could be, it could be Zerubbabel, Yoshua, and maybe Sheshbazzar, or maybe the third is Ezra or Nehemiah, right? Particularly because Nehemiah when you say began to build all that had fallen down from that house, that does work with Nehemiah. But 2 of them are almost certainly Zerubbabel and Yehoshua. And the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they could not. They are all the kind of neighboring nations here are being identified as somehow connected to Edom, right? They rebuilt the temple. They began again to place a table before the tower. They have a mizbeach, they have an altar where they bring sacrifices, but all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. That, of course, that pollution and not bringing impure sacrifices is the topic of the book of Malachi. So it's clear that it's drawing from that, this idea that they were bringing sacrifices, but bad sacrifices, right? And besides all these things, the eyes of the sheep were blind and they did not see, and their shepherds likewise, the people and their leaders were sinning, right? And they have more destruction. And the Lord of the sheep remained silent until all the sheep were scattered over the field and were mixed with them, and they did not save them from the hand of the beast. Okay, and all this is kept in account. Then we have from Alexander, into the 2nd century. So Nicholsburg thinks in this that the eagles may represent the Ptolemies, but and that this verse is talking about the wars of the first Diadokoi in 323 to 301 BCE, right? And here we're getting to more modern history, right? Where it's talking about different rulers, but then we switch into the end time, okay? And now we're coming into the end time, and this end time has certain aspects that are very much part of typical of the way kind of the present time leading to the end time is being described. Now I'm going to take a pause here. There's some comments that absolutely deserve me to address them. So Susan says, is the Assyrian exile of the 10 tribes described? No, it isn't. It's not. It's pretty much skipped over. At least it's not described separately, I should say. Sharon says, Edom did take advantage of Babylonian encroachment and attack the example, right? Yes, absolutely. Edom did a couple of things. One of the things was that while Judea was being attacked from the north, they were taking bites out of the south, right? And as we all know, fighting a war on two fronts, one of the is a terrible thing, and that's one of the things that Edom was doing. They were taking advantage of the fact that we were fighting on the northern front to take bites out of our southern area. Another thing that Edom was very possibly did was one of the main ways to escape south on the kind of what you call Derech HaMelech, the main road, went through Edom, and it seems that they were capturing Jews and handing them over to the Babylonians. So that's also possibly one of the things that they were doing. Besides also probably joining in and probably at least trying to get some of the spoils. Yes.
Did you say who the 23 shepherds were supposed to be?
The 23 shepherds here. No, I didn't. And I don't know. It's hard to know in terms of, it's hard to know. It really is hard to know who they're referring to at any given time. I can say that if we look at here, so if we're looking at right here, we're talking about the Maccabean revolt. And look, lambs were born of those white sheep, and they began to open their eyes and to see and to cry out to the sheep. Now, these lambs, they can see the right way. Open their eyes mean they're righteous. They can see the right way to do, but they did not listen to them nor attend to their words, but they were extremely deaf. When it was the older sheep did not listen to them nor attend to their words, but they were extremely deaf, and their eyes were extremely and excessively blinded. And I saw in the vision that the ravens flew upon those lambs and seized one of those lambs, and this is possibly Onias III, Chonio, who was killed by a Seleucid official in 171 BC. Okay, so the Seleucid would be the raven, and seized Chonio and dashed the sheep in pieces and devoured them. And I saw until horns came out on the lambs, and the ravens were casting down their horns. And I saw until a great. Now this is probably added, and I saw until a great horn spread on one of those sheep, and it looked on them, and their eyes were open. They cried out to the sheep, and the rams saw it, and they all ran to it. This imagery is clearly drawn from Daniel, right? Daniel 8:7-9, and this is the rising of the Maccabees, right? This is the rising of the Maccabees. Their battles with Seleucids. The big horn would be Yehuda the Maccabee. And besides this, all those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were still tearing the sheep in pieces, flying upon them, devouring them. The sheep were silent, but the rams lamented and cried out. Now here you can see this translation makes this edition shows what that the italicized verses seem to be an update of a slightly earlier apocalypse, and they're interpolated around 163 to 161 BCE. Okay, so this was added to make it work very well with the Maccabees with the description of Yehuda and the Maccabees in general. And those ravens were struggling and fighting with it. And I saw until the shepherds and the eagles and those vultures and the kites came, they cried to the ravens to smash the horn of that ram. And they struggled and made war with it. And it was struggling with them and cried out that its help might come. And I looked until that man came who wrote the names of the shepherds. This was the angel who was keeping account of all the evil leaders, and brought them before the Lord of the sheep. And he helped it and showed it everything. His help came down to that ram. Okay. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came upon them in wrath, and all that saw him fled, and all fell into darkness before him. The Maccabees start winning. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered and brought with them all the wild beasts, and they all came together and helped one another smash the horn of that ram. And I looked at that man who, so if we look at, this says the wild sheep, and all the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered and brought with them all the wild sheep is what's actually written in the text. And here, Nicholsburg has decided to amend it to beasts. So the way I've understood it is that the wild sheep were those apostate Jews, where that the apostate Jews joined with the enemies and were on the other side. Okay, they were fighting against the Maccabees, but he amends it to work with that it's all these other nations. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the word of the Lord until he opened the book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds were. And he showed before the Lord of the sheep that they destroyed more than those before them. Okay, and then God essentially punishes them. And I saw until a large sword was given to those sheep. This is actually, there's a scene like this in second Maccabees. In second Maccabees 15 to 16. Yehuda Maccabee has a dream where Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, gives him a golden sword as a gift from God against his enemies. Okay, so this is a possible parallel. And the sheep went out against all the wild beasts to kill them, and all the beasts and the birds of heaven fled before them. Okay, and now, so we come, it's the victory of the Maccabees. Okay, and now we're going to the New Age. Okay, so now we're jumping into now an end of the new and a beginning. How, yes, let's do this. It's actually very interesting. Okay, so stick with me. This is a very interesting vision of the future. Okay, still, of course, we're still in animals. All right, so first we have the judgment. Now, remember what I told you, that everything is kind of in a holding state, waiting for this final judgment. You don't have too much punishment happening after death. It's waiting for this judgment. And that's what's going on here. I saw until a throne was constructed in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat upon it. He took all the sealed books and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep, he being the angel. And the Lord summoned those first 7 white men, angels, and he commanded them to bring before him, beginning with the first star that had preceded those stars. This is Asael, the one who went down first and taught them forbidden knowledge, who had preceded those stars whose organs were like the organs of horses. The angel that came down before the angels came down to mate, that first angel, right? Bring him to me. And he said to the man who had been writing before him, who was one of the 7 white ones, he said to him, remember the 3 angels and 4 angels we discussed earlier who were involved in punishing the watchers. Bring those 70 shepherds to whom I delivered the sheep, who took and killed more than I commanded them. And look, I saw all of them bound, and they all stood before him. And judgment was exacted first on the stars, first on the angels, and they were judged and found to be judged on the watchers, I should say, first of the watchers, and they were judged and found to be sinners. And they went to the place of judgment, and they threw them into an abyss, and it was full of fire, and it was burning and was full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged, people, right, and found to be sinners, and they were thrown into that fiery abyss. They too were thrown into the fire. No, they weren't punished right away. It had to wait for judgment day. And I saw at that time that an abyss like it was opened in the middle of the earth, which was full of fire. And they brought those blinded sheep, and they were all judged and found to be sinners, the Jews who didn't do what they were supposed to do. And they were thrown into that fiery abyss, and they burned. And that abyss was to the south of the house, right? This is Gay Ben Hinnom, right? This is the valley of Ben Hinnom, or Hinnom, which is where the sinners burn. And I saw those sheep burning and their bones burning. Again, punishment waits for judgment day for all these sinners. They were all in holding, and now comes judgment day and they get punished. And I
Miriam,
stood up, yes.
isn't it interesting that Gabe Enom here is to the south of the house and not to the west of the house?
It is a little strange, and maybe I'm reading it. Let me double check to see. And what I'm double checking, by the way, is my own, is what I've done. So I'm not, I always say, like, I'm not stealing anything, what anyone else has done here. Let me see if I have a note on that. Okay.
Geographically, the Gabe Ben Hinnom pours into
No,
the Kidron.
it is kind of south. It does lie
It is,
to the south of Old Jerusalem.
because at the tip of Ir David, Gabe Ben Hinnom pours into the Kidron,
Right,
and that's to the
right.
south
So
of Ir
you
David.
can, yeah. So you can't see if you're thinking about Ir David, if you're thinking about ancient Jerusalem, it is to the south. So that's what we're talking about here.
For today, where we mark it is more like where Chutzot HaYotzeret, which is more to the west. I guess it goes
If
on.
you're gonna go to a concert there, yes, it's more to the west. But if you're gonna burn there, more to the south. There we go.
Okay.
But no, I think, and also there's always a question with some of the. In this case, I don't think that's true. There's another place where in Enoch it goes into a lot of geographical markers where it's very difficult to find out what it's talking about. It's not so clear whether the person who was writing had it kind of in front of him or not. One of
the first things I was taught as a tour guide is Gehinom Matchil Basochnut. The building of the Sochnut is the actual origin of Gabe Hinnom. That, of course, is to the west, but the connection point is to the south, and I think that's what they were referring to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clearly what it's referring to, but and that's just that's kind of how the direction we have to go in. And I stood up to see until that old house was folded up, and they removed all the pillars. And all the beams and ornaments of that house were folded up with it, and they removed it and put it in a place to the south of the land. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house. They take the old one, it's not good enough, and they get rid of it. And God brings a new temple, larger and higher. Actually, I should say a new house, which is a new Jerusalem. Not just the house is Jerusalem, the tower is the temple. So he brings a new Jerusalem, larger and higher than that first one. He erected it on the site of the first one that had been rolled up. And all its pillars were new, and its beams were new, and its ornaments were new and larger than those of the first one, the old one that he removed, and all the sheep were within it. And I saw all the sheep that remained, and all the animals on the earth, and all the birds of heaven were falling down and worshiping those sheep and making petition to them and obeying them in everything. And this, of course, is the vision of the future that all the nations of the earth, right, will come to Jerusalem and recognize God, right? And also recognize his people. After that, those three who were clothed in white, who had taken hold of me by my hand, who had previously brought me up the three angels, with the hand of that ram that also was taking hold of me, set me down among those sheep before the judgment took place. And all those sheep were white, and their wool was thick and pure. These are all the good sheep. These are all the good Jews. And all that had been destroyed and dispersed by all the wild birds and all the birds of heaven were gathered in that house. The resurrection of the dead. Everyone who had been killed by these foreign nations is back. They're back. They're pure. And God is happy. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced greatly because they were all good and had returned to that house. And I saw until they laid down that sword that had been given to the sheep, the sword that had been given to Yehuda Maccabee. They brought it back to his house and sealed it up in the presence of the Lord. There's no more war, right? We don't need the sword anymore. And all the sheep were enclosed in that house, but it did not contain them. Of course, and this is the prophecy of Zechariah, that will overflow Jerusalem. The walls won't contain us because there'll be so many people. And the eyes of all were opened, and they saw good things. And there was none among them that did not see. None among them that did not see means everyone knows the right thing to do. Everyone's behaving correctly. No one is sinning. Remember, being blinded means sinning. Being blinded means not knowing and sinning. And I saw how that house was large and broad and very full. And I saw, so this is the redemption of Israel, right? They're brought back to life. They're brought back to life. They are rewarded. They're living in a beautiful, full, overflowing Jerusalem. No more war. The nations have recognized Jerusalem. They're all coming, and they're recognizing Israel, the place of Israel and Jerusalem in the world. And I saw how a white bull was born, and its horns were large. This is fascinating. After we have this redemption of Israel, everything's good for us. Now, what do we have? A non-Jew, a Gentile, is born, and he's a white bull. He is pure. He's going back to that Adam and Eve, primordial state, and its horns were large. And all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven were afraid of it and made petition to it continually. And I saw until all those species were changed, and they all became white cattle. This non-Jewish leader is going to essentially reform all the nations and bring them back to this single nation, all of white bulls and cows, right? And the first one became leader among them, and that leader was a large animal, and there were large black horns on its head. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it and over all the cattle. All the Gentiles had become good. They had a leader, God, and God is happy, right? And I slept among them and awoke, and I saw everything. And this is the vision that I saw while I slept, right? And he's then after that, I wept bitterly. He wept bitterly because of what's going to happen to the Jews before they come to this final vision. But this is the animal apocalypse where we're going through the history, the biblical history, as told in the Bible, skipping certain parts, going through more modern, quote unquote, history that's more in modern memory, and jumping as frequently apocalypses do, going from modern memory right to the final age, because that's what everyone's hoping for. Everyone's hoping for now the final age begins. Now the final age begins. It works very well with this idea that with the Maccabean victory, people were expecting the final age to start now. What's interesting here is just how much, not only that there's a redemption of Israel, it's very, very clear that it's very and very important that there's a redemption of the Jews, of Israel, of Jerusalem, of the temple. We get everything that was promised. And then there's redemption of the other nations. That there is and that led by a leader comes along, not Jewish, right? This isn't a Christian thing, not someone from the Jews, and this is after the Jews have been redeemed, but the Gentiles will also be redeemed, right? And they will be Gentiles. They'll be righteous Gentiles going back to the original righteous Gentiles. Let's say Noah, like Noah is a white bull, Adam is a white bull, right? So going back to that kind of Edenic state. And that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about this kind of apocalypse. I'm just going to take a pause. Susan asks, why does the author feel the need to retell the story substituting animals for people? Why not just create human characters set in a mythical location? So again, I said this in the beginning, that that it adds an air of mystery. It adds an air of, I'm being cryptic, you have to figure this out. And also it makes you feel good when you figure out what they mean, right? It engages you a little bit more in the story when you're like, oh yeah, I know who it's talking about, as opposed to just telling you who it's talking about, right? Oh yeah, that's Moshe. And those were those were the people of Midian, who are also the people of Ishmael, like that. Like it gives you a sense of satisfaction and also engages you more in the story. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Miriam?
Yes.
If I could go back just for a moment to the 70 shepherds and the 23 shepherds. And I'm getting this really loud echo.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how it would work in, but it's almost impossible not to think of the great Sanhedrin of 70 and the lesser Sanhedrins of 23.
I mean, I like that. I mean, I like that as a concept. In other words, is that sort of the way they're thinking, you know, it's you see, like you have, so you want to say that the 23 shepherds are like kind of a council and the 70 are kind of like a council, right?
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
you
look,
can,
I
even
like I said,
with-
I don't know how it would work exactly, but the numbers sort of like jump out at you.
right. No, I think I think that's good because they are grouped together. Like they're not saying, oh, the 23 shepherds, you know, each one for X number of hours. I do, it's very interesting. That's a good point. I don't know really what to do with it. You know what I mean? But the
Yeah.
idea that we're talking about kind of a, you know, each time it's like a council of leaders who are doing that, right? Each time for a certain period of time. Any other questions or comments?
Miriam,
Yes.
could you, I don't know if you want to send this to us in an email or just run through now what all the different animals represent, because it gets confusing at some point.
All of them. I guess I can write you an email. Yeah, write you guys an email with all of them. The main ones, and some of them are guesses. Some of the main and obvious ones you have just here, like before there are nations. Before there are nations, that's cows and bulls, right? When you have bulls and cows are before there are nations at all, right? Abraham is a bull, right? Even and like there are nations that break off, but Abraham is still, you're still in kind of that pure line. Abraham is still considered a bull. Noah is a bull. Then as soon as you have like Jews or sheep, rams, I should say rams. I always say sheep, but like it's rams and sheep. Edom is boars, essentially pigs. Ishmael are donkeys. Egyptians are wolves. Midianites, because of that verse with Yosef, are also called donkeys.
Right. Who did you say? Wait a second. Who's wolves?
Wolves are Egyptians.
Egyptian. Okay.
Just one-sided
Dogs are
correction.
Philistines. Yes.
One-sided correction, not donkeys, asses, because they're wild asses, pere. Because donkeys are
wild asses. Good point.
domesticated, and these
That
guys
is a
are
good
wild.
point. That's a good point. Wild asses. Yes.
And
dogs
dogs
are
are-
Philistines. Dogs are Philistines. Foxes are Ammonites. Eagles are possibly lions are Babylonians. Babylonians, Chaldeans. So this has foxes, Ammonites, and then leopards would be the Arameans.
Wait, who's the Arameans again? I didn't hear you.
Leopards.
Leopards, who's the Assyrians?
They're not there. Now,
So-
again, the idea that the leopards are the Arameans is taken from the idea, so the leopards are not necessarily Arameans and the hyenas are not necessarily Moabites. Both of those are taken from the idea that what's going on is a version of this verse, and I'll share my screen again. 2 Kings 24:2, Lachem Bet Chafdalad Bet, that Nebuchadnezzar sent raiding bands of Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites. Right. And then you're like, okay, who's missing? So then you add that and the idea is that 89, that chapter 89 verse 55 is parallel to that verse, right? Otherwise, we don't know what those two animals are. We don't know.
Miriam?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you
and-
mentioned
yeah.
maybe
Go
you
ahead.
mentioned that. Okay, maybe you mentioned it and I didn't hear, but do you see a connection maybe in the style of writing between Hanoch and Daniel? Because both of them have this fable with the animals symbolizing nations.
Right. So, and in fact, so that's one of the things that is possible, is that all that stuff with the horns is possibly an interpolation based on Daniel, right? Because Daniel also has all that stuff with horns and different animals. Here, it's much more precise than Daniel, but I think both of them are doing the same thing, which is giving you a layer of code to figure out and making it feel that much more mysterious, right? In other words, there's this idea that we want to give this in code. It should feel mysterious, but it also needs to be a code you can work out, right? There are a lot of different places in Second Temple literature, and even stuff for right after the Second Temple, where you're using animals to symbolize different nations, different rulers frequently also. And Fourth Ezra, different rulers. So yeah, it's not unusual, and I think it's doing a similar thing, even though Daniel feels in certain places harder to figure out, a little bit more cryptic. Whereas here it's like, why are they even bothering? It's so obvious. Why don't you just say, right? So yes, I see a question.
What was I'm wondering, like, what was the felt experience supposed to be like for people who were reading this? Were they reassured that things work out in the end, or what? Like, why read this?
Yes, I think so. I think the idea is everything he suffered was according to plan. It's a sucky plan, it's a painful plan, but everything was according to plan. And now everyone's going to get theirs. The wicked are going to be punished. The righteous are going to be rewarded. All those people who were killed, back. They're going to come back. Right? And the idea is, the more precise you can be in terms of, like, when you're placing recent history into the mouth of Enoch, you're like, oh, it was all prophesied. And I know this happened 5 years ago. So if he prophesied what happened like 5 years ago or 2 years ago or last year, and then he prophesied that we're going to come to the end time and everyone's going to be rewarded, well, then, and we know that in this period, this type of thinking was very, very popular, that we're in the end time. We're in the end time, right? And this explains, like, when you get into like Qumran texts, where they're actually saying this explains why it's so hard to be us, right? Why are we so persecuted? Because in the end time, God lets Belial kind of out to play, and Belial is persecuting us, but that means we're close to the end, right? So,
do the Christians interpret the final white bull as Jesus? There's this white bull among the nations. Do they?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't believe academics do, because it's so, like, any academic who's reading this knows that there's something else going on, because any Jew would not say Jesus is not a Jew, right? And even early Christians would not say Jesus isn't a Jew. But I think it's certainly possible. Like, I need to look a little bit more into the interpretation of Enoch, like among early Christians, etc. Like, by early Christians, I mean, like, not the Jesus movement, but the early church, right?
The Gospels also use the same metaphor of the blind as being those who have gone astray, the sinners.
Yeah, I would absolutely, and it's very, very typical of this period. Like, you see it not just in Enoch, you see it all across the board. Like, being blind means you are going astray, you don't understand. And a theme that you see a lot of, and you see it here also, that we looked at, we just kind of did it briefly, is this idea that the young generation are the guys who know what's up. The young generation are the ones who have their eyes open. The previous generation, they're the sinners, and we see the right way to go, right? And that's also a theme you see in different works.
By the way, in terms of dating, Enoch 1 is roughly the same period as Daniel, isn't it?
Again, we have to talk about what part of First Enoch. This part of First Enoch, yes. So this part of First Enoch, yes. And which part of Daniel? Second part of this part of Enoch, and second part of Daniel.
The second part of Daniel.
Yeah. Are yes, the date is very close. If you're talking about the Book of the Watchers, much earlier than the second part of Daniel, which is kind of the where we see the parallel. But yes, you could absolutely study this apocalypse next to the Daniel apocalypse, next to all these different apocalyptic works. If we were going to have a class on apocalypse, right, that's something that we could absolutely do. Well, thank you all for joining me. This has been a lot of fun, and we will continue with even more Enoch in our next class.